NBA great Shaquille O'Neal walks inside the first-class cabin of a commercial flight. He immediately grabs everyone's attention, standing at 2.16 m tall without any introduction for commercial flying. Muscle frame like a living tower surrounds him naturally and looks up, some whispering, others rapidly. Taking pictures of the basketball legend they had only seen on TV, he walks to his seat, the roomy first-class chair seeming little in comparison to his weight. Frame with a familiar action, Shaq carefully lowers himself and adjusts to find the most at ease posture. Around his neck glimmers a huge gold chain with a finely crafted cross pendant emblem, not only of faith, but also of the guy himself. He's always worn from his days ruling the court to his successful post-NBA life, the flighties. Running nicely till a flight attendant approaches, the young woman smiles, but it's not totally perfect. Natural, as though something is bothering her, but her eyes are off. It's on the chain around his neck. Shaq tilts his head slightly, his deep brown eyes blazing with a mix of suspicion and intrigue. At first he assumed the flight attendant was only coming over to say hi or offer refreshments like most first-class attendants do. But no, she wasn't staring him in the eye, nor was she studying the drink tray in her hands. Her eyes was riveted on the gold chain, like if it were something forbidden, something that shouldn't be there. Shaq waits, but she doesn't speak straight away. She seems to be straining internally, as if carefully selecting her words before uttering something that could cause a reaction. After a few seconds of silence, she takes a deep breath, offers a feeble smile that can't quite cover her nervousness, and says, "Mr. O'Neal, we would desire to create a warm atmosphere and ensure all travelers feel welcome." Her voice sounds gentle, but Shaq immediately recognizes the subtle insincerity in every sentence. He's faced many in-depth interviews, psychological games on the court, and understands when someone is attempting to hide a troublesome request. He raises an eyebrow, leaning little forward, his gaze sharpening, and the flight attendant swallows hard, her hands tightening around the notebook in her fingers as if searching for something to cling on to. Finally, she says, "Some passengers could feel uncomfortable with that piece of jewelry." Shah narrows his gaze, his lips twist into a half smile, not because he thinks it hilarious, but because he can't believe what he's hearing. "That piece of jewelry," he repeats, his voice low like distant thunder. The flight attendant preserves the smile, but here he is reflect her mounting strain. "Yep, we're just attempting to make a nice setting for all the passengers on this aircraft." Shaq chuckles softly, but not because he finds it humorous. It's because of the ridiculousness of it. A guy over 2 m tall who's faced the hardest players in the NBA, won many titles, and now he's being called out for a jewelry. But when he looks into the flight attendant's eyes, he understands. She's not joking. The surrounding space looked to freeze for a moment. Shaq didn't rush to speak right away. He just stared at the flight attendant, his gaze calm yet keen like a predator. It had just identified its opponent's weak place. "You're telling me that age jewelry might make someone uncomfortable?" Shah's voice was deep and leisurely, but each phrase had a weight that pressed down on the environment. He wasn't yelling, wasn't slamming on the table, but the way he spoke made each phrase seem as heavy as a dumbbell. The flight attendant tightened her hold on her notepad, trying to preserve her professionalism, although the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. "A hint of tension. We hope you can collaborate." She repeated, her tone now reduced, lacking the initial confidence. The statements appeared benign, but Shaq recognized that this was not a suggestion, it was a disguised demand. The atmospheric sphere in the cabin began to shift. A few individuals started to tilt their heads. Some even raised their phones as if poised to record. No one said anything, but their yes spoke volumes. They were eager to see how this would unfold. Shaq cocked his head slightly and gently leaned back in his seat, a motion full of dominance. He didn't need to display rage. The sheer presence he controlled was enough to dominate the situation. "Thus let me ask again." His voice rang out, neither fast nor slow, but each syllable had weight. "If I wore a alternative symbol, would you say the same thing?" The flight attendant blinked more sooner than usual, plainly put in a difficult position. This question hit right at the core of the issue. Shaq didn't clarify what a different symbol signified, although everyone knew then. A nearby passenger piped up, shattering the tent. Silence. Would you say this to someone wearing a headscarf or another religious necklace? That question was like a punch to the logic behind the prior request. The flight attendant froze here. He's visibly wavering as if she'd been pushed to the edge and didn't know how to back away. It was no longer just a simple chat. This has become a lot greater issue, and she was starting to realize that at moment was like a spark, lighting a storm boiling beneath the surface. Apperson seated nearby, trying to appear like he was checking his phone, but his fingers swiftly swiped across the screen, turning on the video mode. The camera slowly shifted toward Shaq and the flight attendant, filming every bit of the talk, which was becoming increasingly tense. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin changed noticeably, as if the cabin pressure had fallen slightly. Not enough to feel suffocating, but it was no longer as calm as previously. Mild whispers transformed into hushed murmured, and the passengers' eyes were no longer fixed on their phone screens or magazines. Instead, they were directed toward the towering man, and the flight attendant standing before him maintained his customary, cool air. But anyone observant would have noted that the muscles in his shoulders had stiffened, a clear indicator of discomfort. He didn't need to act angry. His simple presence, his quiet, was enough to make everyone aware he wasn't pleased. His deep, steady voice shattered the increasingly heavy tension in the air. I've flown hundreds of FL trips, but I've never heard anything as ludicrous as this. The flight attendant seemed to have anticipated this reaction, but still appeared nervous. She took a breath, trying to keep her voice quiet but unable to disguise her tension. We just want to make sure all passengers feel comfortable. Sir. Shaq slightly tilted his head, his piercing look seemingly studying every expression on her face. His serenity was not a sign of acceptance, but rather a quiet challenge. He leaned back, but his voice remained firm and unwavering. If this is the airline's rule, I want to see it in writing. The surrounding space appeared to stop for instant. Passengers began exchanging confused glances. Some subtly leaned forward, definitely waiting to see if the flight attendant could come up with a reasonable answer. But the problem was, she couldn't. The flight attendant paused, her hand reflexively grasping the notebook she was holding, as if attempting to find some answer that may justify the circumstance. But she knew well that there was no regulation forbidding passengers from wearing jewelry with religious symbolism. And there was certainly no clause in the airline's policy claiming that a necklace could make another customer feel uncomfortable. The tense moments went on, displaying her mounting anxiousness. Her eyes began to quiver, her body leaning slightly back as if subconsciously trying to retreat from the chat. Yet Shaq remained sitting, his attention steadfast, never leaving her. He didn't need to say anything more, because at that moment the flight attendant understood she had just backed herself into an impossible scenario. The entire first-class cabin was expecting for an answer, and she had none. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew stiff, as if someone had simply dropped the temperature by a few degrees. No one talked, but all the passengers' gazes were locked on Shaq and the flight attendant, who stood frozen, her face stiff as though imprisoned in a circumstance she couldn't escape on her own. Whispers began to spread like ripples radiating outward when a stone is tossed into a peaceful lake. Some passengers silently lifted their phones, a little higher, no longer hiding the fact that they were recording the situation. A sensation of a significant event about to unfold flooded the air, and it was evident that everyone understood this. Story wouldn't finish gently just a few seconds. Later, another figure approached, a middle-aged man, tidy in look, his uniform perfectly ironed with a commander's emblem attached to his chest. His salt and pepper hair and stern attitude revealed that this was a man not readily moved by emotions. Someone adept in handling challenging situations. What's going on here? His voice was deep and serious, not loud but commanding, immediately silencing the whispers surrounded him as piercing eyes went over Shaq, then glanced at the flight attendant, who was now more upset than ever. The young woman straightened up suddenly, as if brought out of her earlier shyness. She replied rapidly, her voice trying to retain professionalism, but failing to mask her tension. Mr. O'Neal is wearing a piece of jewelry that may be disturbed into other passengers. Her words rang across the silent cabin. Yet instead of calming the circumstance, they caused several passengers to snicker or shake their heads. In shock, despite her efforts to appear composed, she unconsciously glanced around as if seeking support, but instead all she received were glances of suspicion. With rage, the supervisor was silent for a few seconds, as though weighing every word he was about to utter. He turned his focus from the flight attendant to Shaquille, finally chose on the big gold chain, with the dazzling crucifix hanging from his neck. A symbol so unmistakable, so familiar, and most crucially absolutely legal that moment, lasted only briefly. Yet it was long enough for everyone in the cabin to realize that something was moving. Finally, the supervisor gently took a breath and stated in a calm yet authoritative tone, "He is completely allowed to wear it," a simple statement, yet one hard enough to send waves throughout the first-class cabin. The flight attendant quickly turned pale, as if the entire foundation she had just sought to establish in this talk had been broken in an instant. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say anything to excuse herself, but no words came out. She understood things had gone too far. And more importantly, she had made an unforgivable error. No one needed to say anything more as the flood of indignation spread throughout the first-class compartment. A few passengers nodded in agreement, some murmured loudly, while others no longer hid their dissatisfaction. A man sitting straight across from Shaq shook his head, sending off a mocking sigh. "I can't believe she tried to achieve that." In another corner, a woman's voice rang out clearly. "No longer restrained are we, really living in a world where someone has to obtain permission to wear a religious sign." The situation had spun beyond of the flight attendant control. But the worst was yet to come. The mood in the first-class cabin was already strained, but after the supervisor's decisive words, a wave of fury immediately spread, like a spark striking in a gasoline tank. People who had been peacefully observing up until that moment no longer stayed silent. A middle-aged man clothed in a clean suit suddenly sprang up from his seat, his eyes flaming with frustration as he stared directly at the flight attendant. "How ridiculous! People wear bracelets, amulets, or whatever they want every day, but Shaq can't, huh?" His words acted like a wake-up call, kindling the frustration that had been seething in the hearts of the other passengers. A young woman seated near the aisle nodded vigorously, then instantly set out her tone, equally packed with anger. This is, suddenly in an instance, the storm that the flight attendant had been striving to hide for so long came out. Entirely gone were the gentle whispers now. The first-class cabin was loaded with loud noises, echo and unhappiness everywhere. Some passengers fought over what had just happened, while some outright criticized the flight attendant handling of the situation. Astonishing, who does this? Airline think they are to tell someone to take off their religious emblem if this is a policy. Why don't they make it public, or RER just targeting those they think they can bully? This won't stop here for certainly. In another corner, a man raised his phone up high, no longer hiding the fact that he was recording the entire episode. The camera was positioned right at the flight attendant, the supervisor, and even Shaq. However, in the midst of the mayhem, Shaq remained immobile. He didn't engage in the discussions or react unduly. He merely sat still, his gigantic figure standing like a statue amidst the uproar. No words needed, no activities necessary. The truth stated for itself. His face, with eyes calm yet laced with disappointment, was enough to give a strong message. He was not someone to be bullied, and he wouldn't let this happen to anyone else. On the other side, the flight attendant became pale, her lips trembling, as if she wanted to say something, but didn't know where to begin. The weight of everyone's glance in the cabin pressed down on her, as if each person was demanding an explanation. She couldn't provide. The supervisor, who had stayed calm from the outset, could now sense that the issue was beyond his control. He looked to the flight attendant, his stare filled with warning, as if to say, "You've messed this up." And then a voice from the rear cut into the strained air. "Did you truly expect this would?" He kept quiet. All eyes moved toward a middle-aged man, graying hair, slowly laying his phone down on his screen. Everybody could see a post had been shared on social media with hundreds of likes in just a few minutes. The narrative, whether the flight attendant liked it or not, had officially exited the bounds of the first-class cabin. As if the situation wasn't tense enough, Just then, a familiar sound rang out the notification. Bell signaling that the Wi-Fi on the plane had been activated. A brief minute elapsed, but it was enough to transform a disagreement in the first-class cabin into a full-blown tempest on the internet. Shaq bent down, his phone vibrating non-stop in his pocket, without unlocking it. Right on the lock screen, a succession of notifications started popping up. A small film, little more than a minute long, had been placed on Asport's news website, accompanied by a bold headline: Shaquille O'Neal asked to remove his crucifix necklace on a plane. What is this airline doing? The question was a call to action, a catalyst for fury from the online community. And within just a couple minutes, likes, shares, and comments began to explode. Then a person sitting nearby, who had covertly filmed the entire affair, glanced at his phone, his eyes wide. In disbelief, he had released the video only 5 minutes ago, but it already had tens of thousands of views. Shaq immediately read through the comments, each one like a dagger aimed at the airline and the flight attendant behavior. If it were someone else, would they dare do that? This is crazy. People wear all types of emblems every day. But an NBA icon gets harassed merely for a cross necklace. Shaq doesn't owe anyone an explanation. He's an icon. This is blatant prejudice. Don't let this die down. Does this airline want to be boycotted? The responses grew further heated, not just from sports fans, but also from activists for religious freedom, persons who had encountered similar situations and understood that this was not a single example. But the strongest reply didn't come from the internet. It came from passengers on this very aircraft. A man seated behind Shaw, likewise checking his phone, scoffed and then glanced to his companion. This airline just made a terrible error. The flight attendant, standing just a few feet away from Shaq, began to detect a shift in the atmosphere. She could feel the doubtful, seeing disappointed stares from people, and hear the muttering increasing louder. She didn't need someone to say it out loud, but she understood. This story was no longer under her control. The tables had entirely turned at this moment. Shaq still said nothing, but simply by gazing at his phone screen, he understood this battle was no longer only happening in the first-class cabin. It had spilled out, sweeping like a hurricane across the online. And this was just the beginning. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached its peak, and the flight attendant could no longer deny the realization that she had made a grave mistake. The passengers who had previously stayed silently watchful now couldn't disguise their fury. The whispers that once permeated the air had morphed into plain chats full of displeasure, pointed questions, and critical eyes directed straight at her, weighing heavily on each of her uncomfortable movements in what was once a lovely room, now stifling more than ever. She could sense there is an implicit accusation, every phone notice, maybe a new post, a new video, a new wave of indignation forming outside the limits of this aircraft. Her instincts informed her that the situation was no longer under control, and that revelation pushed her into a terror. Her palm held the notepad, no longer to write anything but just out. By natural reflex, when she felt lost, she sought to maintain a calm exterior. But her little actions betrayed her. The continuous blinking, the difficult swallowing, her shoulders slightly bowed as if she were trying to retreat from the gazes coming down on her in a final attempt find an exit. She went to the supervisor, her voice much lower than before, no longer holding any authority or firmness. I didn't imagine it would go this far. The supervisor, who had been trying to remain neutral, could no longer disguise his dissatisfaction. In his stare, he took a deep breath, as if searching for the final amount of patience before responding. You bungled this scenario from the very beginning, and now everyone is watching the implications. The flight attendant swallowed, her lips squeezed closely together as if attempting to come up with a retort, but understanding there was nothing left to defend. She had lost control of the circumstances, and worse still, she had become the villain, not only in this first-class cabin, but also on social media, where millions of eyes were waiting to see how this will finish. Shaq, who had remained fully calm throughout, only observed the unfolding situation like a spectator watching a match with a fixed outcome. He didn't need to increase his voice, didn't need to argue, because the truth had already spoken for him. Tilted his head slightly, his stare calm but piercing, then gave a little knowing smile, not one of gloating or ridicule, but the genuine smile of someone who had witnessed the obvious truth long before, and only now was everyone else discovering it. Now, do you understand? His voice wasn't loud, but in the first class cabin where everyone had stopped to witness the unfolding event, his words rang out clear, solid, like a final pronouncement. An unarguable full stop. The flight attendant stood, frozen, her eyes darting between Shaw, the supervisor, and the surrounding passengers, but none of them provided her a lifeline. She had placed herself in this circumstance, and now she had to confront the implications. There was nothing to rebut, no excuse to make, and most crucially, no way out. The entire first-class cabin fell silent for a few seconds, but everyone understood. This was simply the calm before the big storm hit the space in the first. The cabin seemed suffocating, not because to a lack of oxygen, but because of the tension that surrounded every corner. No one spoke directly to the flight attendant anymore, but their quiet was heavier than any criticism. There were no cries. No one yelled, but their gazes were judgments that didn't need words. She felt it with every awkward step she took and every frantic glance at the passengers who were observing. She tried to continue her job as if nothing had happened. Yet every movement lacked the smoothness of a professional flight attendant. Her fingers grabbed the service tray tighter, but it didn't help hide her trembling. She tried to stroll down the aisle, but even the way she moved was no longer natural. Each stride felt like walking on a delicate floor that could break at any moment. She bowed her head, avoiding eye contact with the people, but she couldn't escape the impression that every attention was still fixated on her, judging every gesture, every move. A passenger sitting beside a middle-aged man with a quiet yet keen manner moved his head towards her. His voice was low, yet clear enough for her to hear. "Everyone is watching you." Simply those four simple words, but they pierced through her mind like a frigid dagger. She stopped for a time, holding the dish even tighter, as if it were the only thing binding her to reality. She didn't respond to the man, but she didn't need to hear anything else to recognize she had committed an irrevocable error. She may continue her work, pretend like nothing had happened, but she knew this wouldn't pass by like a breeze. She had been marked not just by the individuals on this flight, but by millions out there, folks who were watching, sharing, saying. She was no longer a nameless flight attendant, but the focal protagonist in a story gradually going viral. And the worst thing was, she couldn't change it. The stillness around her was not forgiveness. It was a sign of the storm that was going to slam the atmosphere aboard. The flight never completely returned to normal, even though no one was arguing anymore. And the flight attendant had retreated. Backstage, the tension still lingered in the air, like an aftershock still resonating after a massive earthquake. Shaq stayed seated, his eyes deep in meditation, looking out the window as the plane descended inside. The notification for descent was heard, but instead of passengers frantically checking seatbelts or grabbing their things, many were still concentrated on their phones, browsing through articles, reading comments, witnessing. The story burst tremendously when the plane's wheels struck the runway with a succession of sounds rang virtually simultaneously. Passengers' phones vibrating non-stop, news alerts, messages. When friends recently put stuff on social network, Shaq instantly received hundreds of notifications, his phone screen flashing, with texts from friends, co-workers, even strangers. Major news outlets had began publishing the story within hours. The video from the flight had inundated all media, from Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok to major news sites. Some posts had sarcastic headlines, snappy names like airline bans Shaq from donning a crucifix. Is this a prank or religious freedom? Doesn't seem like it on this. Many defenders of religious freedom immediately joined in. Public personalities began speaking out, turning this from a personal incident into a global debate. When the plane eventually stopped and passengers began to exit their seats, Shaw didn't rush. He adjusted his watch, softly fixed his gold chain, then stood up tall and dignified like a tower amidst the swirling mob. When he walked off the plane, no one needed to speak anything. No applause was required, but the eyes that followed him were full with. While in the terminal, An unfamiliar passenger approached him, said nothing, only bowed slightly, a modest gesture, yet full of respect and empathy. Soon after, another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a modest appearance, gently stepped toward him and whispered, "Truly, we support you." Shaq grinned weakly, a smile full of understanding and pride. Yet no more words were needed. He did need to argue, didn't need to explain. Everything had already spoken for itself. This story wasn't simply about a flight. It has become a strong statement about religious freedom, justice, and rising out against what's wrong. And now the world was listening. The account of that flight did not end when Shaq departed the airport. On the contrary, it was merely the beginning of imminent a storm that was growing out of control. Videos of the incident continued to spread swiftly, with articles evaluating, commenting, and debating continually appearing throughout media within 24 hours. This subject has become one of the top subjects on social media, gaining attention not only from sports enthusiasts but also from human rights activists, attorneys, and celebrities. Public pressure rose on the airline, causing them to break their silence with hashtags like "Respect," "Faith Yash," "Justice for Shaq he had." Religious freedom trended. The airline's management having to conduct an emergency meeting to work out how to control the crisis. Big shareholders began to worry, while committed clients openly aired their dissatisfaction on social media, claiming they would boycott the airline until a satisfactory response was delivered. Less than 48 hours after the incident, the airline was required to write an official statement. A quick notice was written on their Twitter and website. "We are aware of the event. Incident occurred on airplane flight number affecting passenger Shaquille O'Neal. Our airline is devoted to establishing a welcoming and inclusive atmosphere for all customers, regardless of religion or culture. We are undertaking an internal investigation to ensuring that such circumstances do not arise in the future." Although the public's reaction did not calm down, the statement was too ambiguous. Lacking a formal apology or any specific mention of the flight attendants' improper behavior, individuals did not want a soothing, stated they wanted a real recognition of the mistake. The pressure content continued to increase as major media outlets got in, having broadcast talks concerning religious freedom and how corporations should behave in difficult situations like this. Some legal experts even questioned if the flight attendants' behavior violated anti-discrimination rules, prompting a bigger debate on religious freedom in public settings. And then the airline could no longer remain silent. 4 days after the incident, another more direct statement was given after a thorough evaluation of the incident. "We acknowledge that a member of our flight attendant team failed to follow correct service rules and participated in inappropriate behavior. We apologize to Mr. Shaquille O'Neal and any travelers affected by this event. The involved flight attendant has been suspended indefinitely pending the conclusion of the internal investigation." So the flight attendant faced the repercussions of her actions. No longer an inconspicuous figure on a plane, she had become the center of public criticism, studied and analyzed. And while the airline may protect her by internal procedures, it was apparent that her reputation had been severely destroyed. As usual, the internet community had no intention of allowing this slide. They wanted to know if this was a unique incident, or if this airline having a history of prejudice against religious symbols. Similar cases began to surface, with other travelers sharing their stories, creating a wider wave of denunciation. However, through all of this, Shaq kept silent. He did not partake in the fiery debates, nor did he post anything to stir up public opinion. He didn't need to, because he had already won without saying much by standing up for himself. Shaq unintentionally became a symbol of courage in the face of injustice, a person who was not easily repressed, and most importantly, a person who voiced the worries of many others, those who had felt isolated, neglected, or compelled to disguise their ideas for the comfort of others. This narrative did not stop on that airline. It became a movement. The echoes of the narrative still echo, not just on social channels, but also in debates at coffee shops, at dinner tables, and on significant television shows. This event has beyond the boundaries of a flight, moving beyond a personal incident. It has become a communal issue, a lesson about religious freedom and human rights in in the current world. Shaquille O'Neal has never publicly attacked anyone, never exhibited rage or made any heavy words. He didn't need to, because the truth spoke for itself. His image, steady, calm, and shaken by unfair demand, produced a more striking declaration than any. Each post online, each viral video, and every discussion that arose all focused around one greater topic. What kind of world are we live in, where somebody is asked to hide their faith just for the comfort of others? Religious freedom. Advocates, perceived a symbol of resistance, those who have been forced to remain silent about their convictions, saw a glimpse of optimism, and others who have been hesitant to express themselves now understand they are not alone. One of the greatest figures in global sports had faced the same challenge, and he did not succumb. A week after the event, Shaq appeared in a television interview where the host posed the question that millions of people wanted to hear. Do you have a message for those following this narrative? Shaq paused for a time, his gaze attentive as if contemplating what he was about to say. Then he simply, slowly but surely remarked, "We have the right to express our opinions anywhere, and no one can take that away. No fancy language, no political comments or controversial remarks, just two brief phrases, yet they held the weight of an unbreakable affirmation, and indeed no one can take that away." This tragedy wasn't simply a lesson for the airline, for the flight attendant, or for those who criticize Shaq. It was a reminder to the globe that religion freedom is not a luxury. It is a fundamental human right, and everyone has the right to hang on to it, no matter who they are, what they believe, or where they are. Shaq didn't speak much, yet he made the whole globe listen. Shaquille O'Neal's narrative on that trip wasn't simply a small occurrence. It was a strong reminder that the right to religious freedom and self-expression should not be compromised for the comfort of others. Presents a wider question for all of us: is today's society genuinely respecting individual rights? Or are we eventually accepting excessive boundaries only to avoid offending a minority? What do you think about this occurrence? Do you believe that people should be able to speak their opinions wherever without discrimination? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you feel this story valuable and worth spreading, please like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other crucial stories that mainstream media might not want you to know.